Shalom. Hi. Welcome back to Worldviews and Collision, where we are having a discussion on some of the stark differences between creation and evolution, but not just organic creation, but theological. And so we're drawing some of these parallels, and we're going to continue to do that now as we get right back in to our subject. One of the things that we understand about Darwin and so forth is that the original book, as a matter of fact, let's put it up on the screen. The original book was titled, not Origin of the Species, but The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Now that was the original title, and of course that was changed over time for political reasons. It was changed to the Origin of the Species. They dropped that part of it because, as you see, one of the backgrounds and the foundations of this teaching was to show the struggle of man by means of natural selection through the Darwinistic thinking process is what favors the white races over the black races, and it became a very racist thing. And it was one of the backgrounds of, I don't want to blame everything on Hitler, but his own testimony says the same thing. So I'm not bringing something into this that I came up with. You can read Mein Kampf, you can read all these books and see that was the thinking process of Hitler, is that through evolutionary thinking, the white man is the favored race because of his superiority over these ancient primitive ancestors, and that Afro-Americans and blacks and Hispanics and Chinese and Japanese are inferior races and so forth. And that's once again that evolutionary thinking process. So moving right along, one of the reasons why we fall prey to these things, these sayings and words and so forth, because words and phrases are important. We've talked about it in the past. Words do mean things. And many times, if you say something often enough, it becomes part of your nomenclature, it becomes part of your thinking process, and whether it's actually true or not, most people don't bother to stop and investigate it to see if the saying or what we're believing is even true. If you say it over and over and over enough, it becomes part of your thinking process. And so I wanted to spend a few minutes before we get back into the thinking or the creation evolution discussion about what I call some common Pavlovian cliches. Common Pavlovian cliches. Let me explain what that means. Pavlov, of course, Pavlov's dog, you've all heard of that. The idea that through training of this dog and ringing a bell and so on and so forth, he would train the dog to respond. Every time he did something consistently, the dog responded. And so we have this use of this phrase in our culture describing someone who just automatically does things without thinking like dogs do, or animals, because they do things instinctively based upon habit over and over and over again. And so we have lots of cliches or lots of sayings in our secular culture that we just commonly accept as being true without even thinking about them. We do the same thing religiously. We have many religious cliches that we throw out there all the time that are not biblical, but we say them often enough that we think they're right out of the Bible. And I want to give you some examples of these two things before we continue, because it's important that you and I remain faithful to what the Scriptures say, and that we respond and we live our lives based upon what the Scriptures say and teach us, and not even sometimes our religious rewording of what the Scriptures say. A lot of times people come to us, do you believe this or do you believe that? And what they've done is they've taken the teachings of Scripture and they've put it in their own words. And then we're supposed to respond positively or negatively to their rewording of what the Scriptures say. I submit to you that we should just simply say yay or nay to what the Scriptures say and not have to conform to your or my rewording of what the Scriptures say. We do that quite often. And that's because we're taught to think that way. Now let me give you some examples of some common Pavlovian displays. Up on your screen, the first one we're all probably all familiar with, the constitutional separation of church and state. Now how many times do you hear that phrase? On our news media, I've heard it spoken from the pulpit, but primarily in writing and in the media, this phrase, after all, that violates the constitutional separation of church and state. How many times have you heard that? We hear it all the time. But does the Constitution tell us that there is a separation of church and state? No, it does not. That's not what the Constitution actually says. But who cares what the Constitution actually says? We're going by what we've been trained to think. The Constitution never makes that statement. Another example is Jews equals Israel. We're just all taught that. Whether it's in the news media or whether it's in a religious situation, we've been taught that when you say Jews, you're talking about Israel, and when you say Israel, you're talking about the Jews. And that's not true. As a matter of fact, the word Jew in itself began as a pejorative term given to the house or the tribe of Judah or Yehuda by their enemies. And as a matter of fact, over time, they took it upon themselves to call themselves that. It's a pejorative term. It's a contraction. In other words, it's mocking. It's a word that mocked them. Because the word in Hebrew is Yehuda. Yehuda, not Jew. But we've become accustomed to that, and so every time we talk about the Jews, we think that that's Israel. And every time we talk about Israel, we think that's the Jews. The Bible teaches no such thing. Israel is a word used to describe, from God's point of view, all 12 sons of a person called Yaakov or Israel. Israel is referring to Jacob. And Judah is only one of the 12 sons. Now let's move on. Another example, there is a Social Security fund. How many times are you and I told when we get our paychecks that such and such went into a Social Security fund and so you'll have it there when you retire? So we say that over and over and over again enough times that we think there's actually a Social Security fund. We think that when we retire, there's a little place over there with my name on it that says, Brad Scott, here's your money. No such thing, my friends, and we all know that. But we just say it enough, we think that it's true. Everything goes into one place, and they spend it on whatever they want to spend. And you all know that. I'm preaching to the choir there. But nonetheless, another example. The Feast of Yahweh, or Jewish feast. How many times have I told one of my friends, talking to one of my religious friends, and told them that I need to leave and get home because we're preparing for Passover? And how many times have they said to me, isn't that a Jewish thing? And I've said to them, oh, do the Jews do that? See, we become so accustomed to words and phrases that we don't even give it any thought anymore. They are Yahweh's feasts or the Lord's feasts, not Jewish feast. Judaism, Jewish does not equal the teachings of the Old Testament. We're just automatically taught that. It's not a Jewish thing. They are the Lord's feast. So that's another cliche, common cliche that we spout all the time. That's not true. Another example. Alcoholism is a disease, for example. Now, so we're bouncing back and forth religiously and in our culture. Alcoholism is a disease. Well, if it's a disease, it's certainly a self-inflicted disease. But we say that often enough that it becomes part of our nomenclature. Another example, the law equals the Old Testament and grace equals the New Testament. Grace in church is the New Testament, law is the Old Testament. We just automatically trained to think that way. Law equals Old Testament, grace in church equals New Testament. Not true at all. Now, the next one here, God inhabits the praises of His people. God inhabits the praises of His people. Let me give you an example of that. I was teaching many years ago, and I was asked to speak at a Calvary chapel. And they asked me to teach on the language, is what they asked me to do. We want you to teach on the language. And they specifically told me that if you could keep from talking about the Sabbath and those Jewish things, okay? And so in my frustration in dealing with this, I said, okay, if this is what you want me to do, I am confident that once you learn this language, you'll begin to change your view of those things anyway. And so I began to talk to them about the new covenant because that was part of the name of their church. And so we were talking about Jeremiah chapter 31 and so forth, the new covenant that was made with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And I was explaining this to them, and they said, well, wait a minute, Israel is Israel and the church is the church. And they didn't even want to hear what I was talking about and what the new covenant was really all about. New covenant wasn't made with any church and Gentiles and so forth. It's made with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And they wouldn't have anything to do with it. No, Israel is Israel and the church is the church. And I said, okay, that's fine, good enough. And so we went on, and the praise and worship leader stands up there and he tells everybody to start getting up, and the music starts going and the bass starts playing and the drums get going and they start singing, songs. He says, everybody get up and stand on your feet because God inhabits the praises of his people. And everybody stands up and they start singing, he came from heaven to earth to show the way. Okay, we're doing the normal things, all right? And then when it's over with, I said, can I talk to you guys a minute? So we went back to another room and I said, can I ask you a question? And I said this to the youth minister. Let me grab my Bible because I'm going to need it here. I said to the youth minister, can you tell me something? I asked you a question. He says, yeah. I said, where in the Bible does it say that God inhabits the praises of his people? Where's that written at? I was just curious. And he says, oh, well, that's easy. And so he opens up his Bible and he starts flicking around here and he turns to the Psalms, which would probably be the logical place to go. And he's flipping back and forth in his Bible looking for it. And I said, the Psalms, I said, let me tell you something. There's only one time in your Bible. And he says, oh, yeah, I know. No, so he's flipping back and forth. And then pretty soon he goes to the book of Proverbs. Book of Proverbs. He starts looking through the Proverbs and he realizes he's not finding. And after a while, a little bead of sweat starts coming down the side of his head like this. And he starts to really get nervous. And so after a while, here's what he did, literally. He turned to me and he says, okay, show us where it's at. And I said, well, okay, it's only one time in your scripture. Turn to the 22nd Psalm. So he turns to the 22nd Psalm and I said, would you read the first couple of verses for us? He says, sure. My God, why hast thou forsaken me, and why are you so far from helping me and from the words of my roaring? Oh my God, I cry in the daytime, but you hear not, and in the night season, and am not silent. But you art holy, O thou that inhabits the praises of, and he stops. And I said, go ahead, read it. You who inhabit the praises of Israel. I said, oh, you mean those people you don't want to have anything to do with? He only inhabits their praises? See, he didn't want to have anything to do with Israel. Israel's totally separate from the church. Remember, Israel's the primitive apes and monkeys with their primitive feasts and festivals. Okay, we're the evolved church. Okay, and so he just kind of substituted the word people in there when it doesn't say that. It's Israel whose praises God inhabits. And Israel, from God's point of view, is all those who believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and follow him. That's Israel from God's point of view. That's not Israel from the world's point of view. From the world's point of view, Israel's over there with black hats and black fuzzy hats and long black coats leaning against the wailing wall, davening and so forth. That's Israel. And everybody else is the church. And that's dominantly the way Judaism thinks of it today as well. That the church is everybody that's not them. So forth. We've got things so messed up with the words in our culture, it's going to be very difficult to untangle the huge mess because we've all gotten used to cliches. And so that is a common Pavlovian cliche as well. God inhabits the praises of his people. Now this next one coming up, since I spent some of my youth in Nevada, growing up in the Toyobe National Forest, I was really on a guilt trip a lot of times when I was young living in that forest because of this cliche right here. And here it is. Only you can prevent forest fires. Only you can prevent forest fires. Every time I saw Smokey Bear when I was growing up and I saw that little phrase and he came on TV and so forth, oh my goodness, I was always afraid I was going to start a forest fire somewhere. And he was always looking at me with that real low voice. Only you can prevent forest fires. And I lived with that guilt all my life until I realized the reality is most forest fires, 95% or more, have nothing to do with you and me. Most forest fires are started by lightning and so forth, and there's not a thing I can do to prevent that kind of forest fire. But we say it over and over and over again, and I'm not trying to say it's okay to start forest fires. I'm trying to say the reality here is when we begin to think about it is man does not start most of the forest fires. Most of them are started by lightning, especially in Nevada where I lived. And another common cliche, Jesus died to free us from the law. Jesus died to free us from the law. It's another thing that we just say over and over and over again. Over and over and over again we say this. But is it true? Is that what the Scriptures teach? Just come back to me, please. Is that what the Scriptures teach? No. What do the Scriptures actually say? The Scriptures teach us that Yeshua died to free us from the penalty of sin. What's the penalty of sin? Death. That's what He freed us from. He didn't free us from the Torah. He died to free us from the penalty of not obeying the Torah, which nobody does. Because of the fall, nobody's keeping all the commandments. We're incapable of it because we're subject to the laws of entropy and we're constantly corrupting ourselves. And so that's one of the reasons why from the beginning to the end, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, it teaches that everything you and I do is as filthy rags. Our righteousness is as filthy rags. That's taught from the beginning all the way to the end. As soon as the fall happens, the Father knows He's faced with a conundrum here. That my people who I love and care about, because they have turned against me and now living according to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, will mix good with evil. I submit to you that many religious people in America who want to do good, they're religious people who want to do good, are simply eating from the good side of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Evil people eat from the evil side, good people eat from the good side. But the Father said, stay away from that whole tree. He says, I don't want you to eat from a tree that has good mixed with evil in it. I want you to eat from the tree of life. Why? Because of the law of like kind. The law of like kind. The tree of life will produce life. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil would only produce good one minute and evil the next. Evil and good and good and evil and evil and evil good, and you'll do good, 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 and you'll do something evil. And you do evil, 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 and you do something good. All right? It's back and forth all the time. God says, eat from the tree of life, and you will produce life. That's what the Scriptures teach from the very beginning. Okay, once again, I remind you that everything is in the beginning, and that's the reason why God is restoring us back to those things in the latter days. Let's move on now. Another quote from A.L. Harrison Matthews, a British biologist. In his introduction to the 1971 reprint of The Origin of the Species, in which the favored races thing is removed, here's what he says. He says, now pay attention to the words once again, the fact of evolution. Now this is one of those examples where the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. And he says the fact of evolution, notice he calls it a fact, is the backbone of biology. And biology is thus in the peculiar position of being a science found on an unproved theory. Now wait a minute. He just said the fact of evolution is now an unproved theory. Can you see where things are, decaying and corrupting here in the thinking process? Then he goes on to say, is it then science or faith? Belief in the theory of evolution. Now we're down to the theory. First we started out as a fact. Now we're back down to the theory. The theory of evolution is thus exactly parallel to belief in special creation. Both are concepts which believers know to be true, but neither up to the present has been capable of proof. Now I submit to you that depends on what you call proof. For those who don't believe something, no proof will do. For those who believe something, any little thing will be proof to them for those who believe it. See, there's always a presupposition or a bias there that you have before you approach something. And so those who choose not to believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I submit to you that if that's their presupposition, there is no proof that you can give them that will make any difference to them whatsoever. So once again, it depends on what your proof is. Now back to the screen. Biochemist and evolutionist Michael Denton, by the way, who is one of those who believes in intelligent design, but he doesn't believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He said, referring to evolution, evolution is an idea which is more like a principle of medieval astrology than a serious 20th century theory. It's more like a principle of medieval astrology than a serious 20th century theory. Francis Crick, the co-winner of the Nobel Prize for DNA, he and a man named Mr. Watson discovered the DNA molecule. Actually, the DNA molecule was actually, most of the work was done by a woman, by the way, but these two guys got all the glory, if you will. Most of the work on that was done by a woman. Since he realized that there's no evidence on earth of the evolutionary process that everybody touts, here's what he said. Now this is the winner, the co-winner of the Nobel Prize. He says, I am proposing direct panspermia, which asserts that life did not evolve on earth. Why does he say that? No evidence, no substance. Instead, life reached earth in a rocket launched by intelligent life from some remote planet. Now I'm going to submit to you that he had no other choice. Since he refuses to believe in a creator, he has no other choice but to say that. I think he's being intellectually honest. Because what you'll find out is that people like this will run to the absurd in order to avoid the obvious. People who choose as an act of their own will to reject a creator who created all these things in the beginning will run to any kind of absurd theory you can think of to avoid what is obviously the substance and evidence right in front of them. So I submit to you that he's being very honest. He realizes that we don't have any evidence. We don't have any evidence of evolutionary process on earth. So his only choice is to say, well, it came from some other remote planet. Now here's what these guys constantly do over time. That's the whole idea of placing things billions of years ago. Since what we see, the substance and evidence that we see with our eyes, we don't believe, we'll put it into some place in some window somewhere where nobody can prove us wrong one way or another because nobody was anywhere near 4 billion or 16.7 billion years old. That's how old the universe is now. When I was in school back in the late 50s and early 60s, the universe was only about 1 to 2 billion years old. 1 to 2 billion years old in the 60s. Now the universe is 16.7 billion years old. So it's aged about 14 billion years just in my short life here. And so if they refuse to believe the substance and evidence, the best way is to keep putting it back in time. And every time they discover that something couldn't have possibly happened in that amount of time, they just keep backing up the time further and further back until you get to some obscure, abstract kind of things, time period that people can't even relate to anymore. You and I are taught that true faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. That's what true biblical faith is. See, because you and I, we look outside the window with our eyes, and what do we see? We see cows producing cows, chickens producing chickens, and tomatoes producing tomatoes. But the unbeliever and the Darwinist and the atheist or whatever, he looks out the side of the window and he goes, I know that's what you see with your eyes. I know that's what's going on. But in reality, billions of years ago, see, now who's operating on no evidence? Us or them? They are. We're relying on the creation that God gave us, and that we are trusting in what our Father said, because that is true biblical faith. Not denying the fact that apples produce apples and tomatoes produce tomatoes, and that's what I see with our eyes, and denying that and say, well, I'm just gonna trust. I'm just gonna trust and believe, even though this is what I see with no. See, that's one of the reasons why many of us religiously have been duped into thinking that God created evolution. I run into that all over the place when I travel. God created evolution and so forth. You don't have that option. The Bible does not teach that and never has taught that. And so, let me give you one more example before we go on, before we conclude here. Physicist Dr. Frederick Hoyle, can you put that up on the screen for me? Thanks. Said that the likelihood that the formation of life from inanimate matter is 1 to a number with 40,000 knots behind it. That means these things did not happen, my friends. The likelihood that the formation of life came forth from inanimate matter, and we're going to discuss this in further detail later, is something that cannot possibly have happened. It's impossible. That's what the substance and the evidence teaches. And so next time with you, we're going to talk about, once again, logical things as well. I like things that are logical and are common sense. And so we're going to investigate, once again, this comparison between organic creation and theological. The words and so forth compared to the organic part as well. We're going to discuss that and continue on that later. So in the meantime, as we always say, cling to your roots, that your days may be long and that you will prosper in everything you set your hand to do. We'll see you next time. Shalom Aleichem.